Hi, everyone. I am Emmett Sanders. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Associate here at Prison Policy Initiative. I've been with PPI for coming up on 3 years now. But before this, I spent a lot of time working to oppose incarceration, carceral surveillance, electronic monitoring, and these things. And as we'll discuss a bit later, carceral surveillance, carceral humanism plays a huge role in the spread of electronic monitoring, as it's often presented as a non-carceral alternative to being locked up. Though, as anyone who's been on electronic monitoring knows, and as I found out myself, carceral humanism is far more carceral than it is human. Carceral humanism at its core isn't a reform, it's a PR strategy that focuses on addressing the objections to harm rather than on changing the harm of the system itself. So today we're lucky enough to be joined by our friends from Community Justice Exchange, Man Mohapatra and James Kilgore. Community Justice Exchange is a national organization focused on ending detention, supervision, and surveillance across the spectrum of the criminal, legal, and immigration systems. They're also the host of the National Bail Fund Network, which is a network of over 90 community bail funds from around the country. And both James and Mona have extensive experience recognizing and combating carceral humanist reforms. Mon is the organizing coordinator for Community Justice Exchange. They are also the author of If They Build It, Organizing Lessons and Strategies Against Carceral Infrastructure. And as part of their initial fellowship with CJE, Mon headed up the No New Jails Network, which was focused on opposing expansion of carceral infrastructure. James is the Building Community Power Fellow at CJE and is the Director of Advocacy and Outreach at First Followers Reentry Program in Champaign, Illinois. He's the author of 7 books, 4 of which were written during his 6.5 years inside California prisons. And he's actually the originator of the term carceral humanism. Uh, Let me just get here next. So we'll hear from them here shortly, but first, just sort of a brief overview of the webinar. So we're going to begin by talking a bit about what carceral humanism is and identifying why it's a problem. Then we're going to take a quick look at some of the places these narratives sort of show up and what kind of narratives sort of accompany them, as well as to look at some of the counter arguments to these. We'll then share a few key strategies for identifying and resisting carceral humanist reform efforts. And then we'll hear from our panelists to learn more about their work and their thoughts on carceral humanism and how carceral humanist narratives and arguments have sort of evolved over time. And then we'll open the floor up to some Q&A. So with that, let's begin.
Emmett, sorry, Emmett, just quickly before you get started, I did want to say that the Q&A is open throughout the webinar. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A as you think of them. We'll answer those questions at the end.
Thank you, Sarah. Um, let me see if I am, sorry. Oh, here we go. So, what is carceral humanism? As I mentioned, it's a public relations strategy. It's presenting, masquerading as a reform, right? So, the public has become increasingly aware that incarceration is brutal and an ineffective response to social problems. Carceral humanism is a response to that. It's repackaging traditional incarceration into a kinder, gentler form of incarceration. It presents itself as a reform or an alternative. However, the focus of carceral humanism isn't changing the system in which harm happens, but rather on making the most egregious parts of that harm more palatable in order to sort of preserve the status quo. Um, at its core, carceral humanism, as we mentioned, isn't a reform strategy, it's a public relations one. So I do want to be very clear that the conditions that incarcerated people are surviving and should not be ignored while people are fighting for meaningful systemic change. As someone who sat in a cell myself for decades, I fully understand and appreciate the necessity of working to make conditions better and in some cases survivable for folks on the inside. However, not all reforms do make things better, and some can actually cause harm inadvertently or intentionally. And so here are a few ways that carceral humanist reforms can actually make things worse. The changes they make are superficial and specific rather than substantial and systemic, right? So Um, sorry. So what happens is that the problem can continue in a different aspect or form. Um, Person first language is hugely important to impacted folks, and in some places, this has been reflected in policy or legislative change, which is great and is the core is a basis of change here. Um, However, meaningful changes in language should be accompanied by meaningful changes in actions, and we've seen some places where the language has been changed in people, individuals in custody and these things, but torture by solitary confinement still continues, or there's a lack of like compassionate release through parole. Another thing is that they can redirect funding and support away from non-carceral community-based responses. Mental health is a prime example of this. Sheriffs argue that they need more money for a bigger jail to provide mental health support. But that money gets taken away from community health centers and places where people actually receive the help they need. Carceral humanist reforms replicate, relocate, or expand the capacity of carceral systems. Um, Electronic monitoring, again, is a great example of this. It's looked at as a way to sort of shrink the system, but it actually has been used to expand it quite significantly. And we'll look and see jail populations also increase while electronic monitoring populations increase, increasing the total number of people under surveillance. And finally, they can stagnate reform efforts. They can kill momentum and make future reforms harder. Carve-outs is a huge example of this, right? A lot of times, carceral humanist reforms will include exceptions to who can actually benefit. So while there may be some initial relief for some, for a lot of others, the harm continues. And worse, the carve-out actually is an agreement that though we've identified a harmful practice, it's okay to sort of continue to inflict that upon a particular group of people. Um, so where do these narratives appear? Well, they appear in a lot of places, but here are just a couple. We mentioned jail expansion. So the compassionate argument. So some jails are often expanded with the argument that we need to create a kinder, gentler place to be, right? So commonly used narratives, we need to build a bigger jail to provide better mental health care. We need to make our jail ADA compliant for people with disabilities, culturally responsive jails, gender responsive jails, these kinds of things like that. However, the problem with this is that every single measurable metric we've seen shows that incarceration itself is an inherently harmful experience. It harms mental and physical well-being. It decreases life expectancy. It increases the likelihood of things like suicide, overdose, and it impacts stabilizing forces such as housing, employment, family connections, all these other things. Halfway houses and post-release supervision. There's this common misconception that parole agents are invested in parolee success, that the parole is a way to sort of transition back and guide people home. Um, and carceral humanism positions parole as sort of a resource, but we know it's actually an obstacle to success. Similarly, like halfway houses or group residence for people leaving prison, they're often depicted as helping sort of ease the transition back into society. However, they can be deeply problematic and set people up to fail. Um, Parole is often accompanied by unjust release conditions, restrictions that undermine people's ability to navigate the reentry process. Halfway houses are largely carceral facilities. Some charge people for rent. Some are run by prison profiteers like the GEO Group, who operate private prisons. Electronic monitoring, and other alternatives to incarceration sound great. The arguments generally depict a world in which we turn away from incarceration and move to more or less restrictive forms of supervision and control. But electronic monitoring, again, and other forms are often used to augment carceral populations rather than to reduce them. And the conditions that people are subject to not only recreate incarceration, they offer a new path to traditional incarceration through technical violations and all these other things. So these are just a few of the places where they show up, and they show up differently in other places as well, and we'll get to that later. So that's what they are. So let's talk a little bit about some of the strategies that you can use to sort of oppose some of these carceral humanist reforms. first we identify is to assess the proposed solution. So when a policy is proposed that might be a carceral humanist approach, there are some questions that we can ask to sort of figure out whether it is or not, right? So will the reform that's proposed increase, reduce, or have no impact upon things like the number of people subjected to harm, the presence of carceral harm in our everyday lives, the carceral power of police and carceral institutions? Does it does it increase or have no impact upon the influence of oppressed communities, right? The folks who are actually subjected to these things. Does it increase the availability of community-based resources, supportive services, all these other things? And I do want to shout out here the work of Critical Resistance because they have done so much around this framework of reformist versus non-reformist reforms. And so I definitely encourage folks to check out their foundational work, their educational materials, because they've been invaluable to learn from. Um, Next, examine the data, right? Some simple questions to ask when data is presented that seem to indicate a need for a carceral humanist reform are: how is that data being shared? How is it being presented? How good is the data? How timely? How specific or accurate is it? What's being downplayed or left out? Who's doing the presenting? Who is actually involved in the collection of the data? Like, what do those with the data of lived experience have to say, right? And could there have been more involved in the creating in the collection of this data? Asking these questions can give you some real understanding about like how carceral humanist these reforms are, as opposed to like what how they represent real change. And finally, offer real alternatives. This is a hard one, but leaning into non-carceral humanist responses, meanings proposing solutions that do things like redirect funding and resources away from carceral responses and into community-based responses to harm, to the roots of harm, that shift focus from retribution to prevention, reconciliation, healing, and addressing harm. Um, and that also increase meaningful opportunities for community engagement, um, and support rather than criminalize marginalized populations and also decriminalize strategies, survival strategies. So these are just a few of the pardon me, these are just a few strategies is we've identified to sort of push back against these, identify and push back against them. But now we're going to turn to a discussion with our panelists to see how they've engaged with carceral humanism and how that's changed. So let's get right to it. So, I've introduced Mon here, Mon Mohabacha from CJE, and James Kilgore from CJE. So we'll just get right into it. James, you are widely credited with coining the term carceral humanism. Can you talk a bit about what kind of things that you were seeing that led you to come up with this term?
Well, thanks, Emmett. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the discussion. So, carceral humanism really emerged from a campaign that I was involved in Champaign County, Illinois, where I live. And this began way back in 2012 when our sheriff came forward with a plan to spend $20 million on a new jail. Now, his rationale for the jail was largely safety and security. He wanted to make sure the community was safe, make sure his staff was safe. We we formed an organization. We did a big campaign in our small county. We went door to door and we asked people how they would like to spend $20 million if they had the chance to make that decision. And virtually no one wanted to spend it on the jail or on police or anything like that. They wanted to improve the living conditions of people in the community. So we also did a lot of one-on-ones with the county board members because they had the vote on this. And we even got Michelle Alexander, the author of the new Jim Crow, to write a letter to the chair of the board encouraging the county not to spend money on jail construction. So when it came to the end of that year and there was a vote on the money for jail, it lost. And we had a party. We celebrated. We were so happy and so proud of ourselves. And we thought this jail was buried forever. Foolish. So early the next year, The sheriff came back and he had a different plan. Now the plan was to build a jail that was going to be better for the inmates, as he called them. So he started talking about comfort, talking about better visiting facilities, better food, better health care, etc., etc., etc. And we realized at that time that the sheriff had outfoxed us, that he now looked like the caring person, and we who didn't want to spend money on a jail looked like we didn't care about the population that was in the jail. So we had to reshape our narrative, and we battled the sheriff for the next 8 years over that jail construction. We kept winning, but eventually, when the COVID relief money came and wishy washy Democrats gave in and voted for the jail, and unfortunately, even today, that jail has been built, and we sit with a proposal from our governor who has presidential aspirations to spend $900 million to build two new prisons instead of putting that money into community. So that's just a snapshot of where the idea of carceral humanism came from, that the sheriff began to portray himself as a caring humanist rather than as someone who was hardline on law enforcement.
It's incredible. Um, Actually, in relation to this, maybe we could turn to Mon. Mon, you headed up the No New Jails Network as part of your original fellowship with CJE, and you've continued to work on this carceral infrastructure in your current role. Can you talk a bit about your carceral infrastructure work and how carceral humanist narratives sort of come into play there?
Yeah, and thanks so much to PBI for inviting me and for this new tool. Emmett, like you said, carceral humanism is a public relations strategy, and that's what has really been clear across different kinds of carceral infrastructure organizing. Carceral humanism, although it undergirds many different kinds of carceral reforms, it's often the easiest to identify in the ways that governments and institutions justify carceral facility expansion through promises focused on improvement, functionality, and modernization. Foundations, think tanks, politicians, activists, all sorts of different communities will point to the bad conditions inside existing facilities and to overcrowding or to a lack of suitable structures for providing services as a reason for why a newer or a nicer, better designed facility is a more humane solution for the worst aspects of incarceration. So I want to give some examples of this that I've seen in my time, both as part of the No New Jails Network and then since then organizing around many different kinds of carceral infrastructure. One really, I think, notorious one includes New York City, where four new borough-based jails are meant to replace Rikers Island, which is a notorious penitentiary. The new jails have been promoted as more livable and more humane than Rikers, which is indeed abject and squalid. They're promised to be more local, therefore making it easier for people to visit and be transported. They're supposed to have nicer murals. They're supposed to have better windows. They're taller, but locality and proximity haven't stopped the city's youth jails from being overcrowded and uninhabitable. And more windows, while certainly nicer, don't change that the city is locking up more people than it was when the jails were approved and doesn't have a plan to actually reduce this overcrowding and crowding in general substantially. Another example I want to share is in Oahu, in Hawaii, where the director of the Hawaii Department of Corrections claims, and I'm quoting this directly, the state desperately needs a new jail. We have an outdated facility with deplorable conditions that is decades beyond rehabilitation, making it difficult for our inmates to flourish. Yet a new jail in Oahu does little to change or correct the fact that HDCR targets Native Hawaiians and enables US military control of the Hawaiian colony, and in fact only makes caging of Hawaiians more efficient for the corrections agencies. These are two jail examples because you see carceral humanism a lot in different kinds of jail facilities, like James just spoke to. But there are also countless other examples across different kinds of facility expansion. So that includes state prisons, detention centers, federal prisons, halfway houses, like you talked about, and other kinds of cages. There are also facilities that have already been built as part of a carceral humanist expansion, like the Las Colinas Detention and Reentry Facility in California, which opened in 2014 as a state-of-the-art replacement for the old jail, and which has all in that time, in the last 12 years, seen many, many incidents of harm towards the people who are incarcerated there. Montana and Illinois are two examples also of state prisons, where there are two campaigns against the replacement of existing state prisons with new ones, ostensibly because the new prisons will be better for aging populations or incarcerated women. And it's also important to recognize that often carceral halfway houses or carceral modern asylums, which have people advocating for them to be reformed, are themselves the consequence of carceral humanism, which really speaks to the cyclicality of carceral humanist policies and narratives. These kinds of narratives and justifications have historically also been trotted out in relation to detention centers. We've seen them more in relation to like pretrial facilities and state prisons, but that doesn't mean that they're not actually being used to expand the detention system as well, particularly because of increasing concern over conditions inside immigration detention facilities, warehouses, and like, of course, these like soft side facilities. And then we've also seen the prevalence of carceral humanism in the ways that the detention system and the deportation machine are often talked about being reformed through alternatives to detention. So you already spoke about electronic monitoring, which is an example of that kind of carceral humanist cyclicality. But every site and city is different, and each has been met with different kinds of responses, emerged from different contexts. And what they share amongst them is that the people who push for these replacements want local residents to believe that these were better than the old facilities, and that improvements to the design, management, and operation of a prison is capable of making it more humane. Carceral humanist policies and reforms also share a desire to make the overall system of punishment more functional and efficient instead of eliminating them. Often, when they do eliminate carceral capacity, they expand the system's overall ability to surveil and incarcerate more people. They take advantage of people's genuine concern over the infinite expansion of policing and social control over how people are treated inside these facilities, then they exploit these concerns to make people compliant participants in the very expansion they oppose. Often, carceral humanists identify the problem as the fact that the cage is exceptionally bad, not that it exists at all, forcing abolitionists and just people who oppose incarceration into a corner versus supporting more visionary ideas about how we take care of each other.
Really appreciate that. I think that's really interesting. I'm particularly interested in the way that you're talking about how carceral humanism sort of feeds itself. It sets itself up to continue in that cyclical way. I think that's really particularly interesting. Um, James, I know I just want to turn back to you just real quick. I know that prior to your work with Community Justice Exchange, you did quite a bit of work on carceral surveillance, and particularly around electronic monitoring. We did some together, as a matter of fact. How did carceral humanist narratives sort of manifest in your work on incarceration, and what kind of strategies did you find most helpful in one, making the case that they were carceral humanist narratives, and two, encountering them?
Thanks for that question, Emmett. I think there's a knee-jerk reaction to electronic monitoring, and that is, well, at least it's better than jail or prison. And I mean, that's the so-called humanist aspect of electronic monitoring. And on one level, that's true. I mean, most people, myself included, and probably Emmett as well, would rather be on an electronic monitor with house arrest than in a maximum security prison. I mean, for some people, being at home can be the worst possible option if it's a violent place or a center of drug activity. But in most cases, we would probably prefer to have our movement tracked than being in a traditional cage or be deported. But this is essentially the wrong approach to the issue as a policy, because what might be the best for an individual isn't necessarily the best for a policy for for the criminal legal system. So EM is carceral. It creates a jail inside your house. It creates your family members. It makes them into jail guards, into prison guards, and it it doesn't provide the kinds of freedom that we want people to have when they come out of prison. I mean, we need something when people are going to come out of prison, or if they're in jail and they're being given a sentence, we want something that reduces the harm of the system and ultimately points us to a different way of thinking, a path to freedom, not to more tolerable forms of punishment, which is what electronic monitoring is. And we've seen over the past years, and particularly if we look at immigration right now, we see that electronic monitoring under ICE is being used more widely than ever. We now have about 175,000 people on electronic monitors under the control of ICE. So it's part of that whole system of punishment, and we can see that this is not going to reduce harm in those communities. Rather, it's going to expand the control that the state and its corporate clients have over the migrant population. And the same thing in terms of people coming out of jail, people who are on parole, and so forth. We need to recognize that electronic monitoring is an industry. And companies like the Geo Group, like BI, the biggest electronic monitoring company in the world, make huge amounts of money off of this. And so that money could be much better spent on providing facilities for people in the community. So, in terms of counter narratives, we always felt that the best approach was to tap into the lived experience of people who had been on electronic monitor. We interviewed dozens and dozens of people, and virtually no one who has been on an ankle shackle will say that it had benefits, that it was a positive experiences. And their grievances ran the gamut from daily fees to inaccurate readings to strict rules of house arrest to difficulties in finding work to the challenges that having someone on electronic monitor posed for family members. Those stories were very powerful. Now we know that statistical data is useful, but lived experience is the most important form of data. But it needs to be pulled together in a coherent, critical way. At times, statistical data provides us, for example, information about how race and class impact on a monitor and what the conditions are like, but the people in charge of EM generally feel no compulsion to keep track of data like racial breakdowns of who is on a monitor or what the impact of EM is on neurodivergent people. So we often had to extrapolate from various personal accounts to make some conclusions, and because otherwise the proponents of EM would just put it forward as a more humane and cheaper alternative than prison, ignoring the racial, gender, and other dimensions of the shackle.
Wow, thank you for that. I'm struck by how important it is to sort of engage the community, to find these stories, to find these narratives, and find that data to sort of counter these like common misconceptions. And speaking of communities, Mon, I know that we talk a lot about, identifying and countering narratives of carceral humanism, but your work is largely focused on organizing communities. And so I'm kind of curious if you could share like what sort of organizing strategies that you found useful in sort of in combating carceral humanist reforms.
Yeah, thank you. And I feel like James actually also just spoke to some of it. And I think some of the questions in the chat are getting at this too. So excited to talk more. There are a couple of strategies that I've seen be especially effective, especially towards an abolitionist horizon where all forms of detention, confinement, and social control no longer exist. First, calling out the hypocrisy and contradictory positioning of those who claim a new facility or a renovated facility is more humane. There are simple changes that could be made that are actually humanizing. For example, decriminalizing certain things, freeing more people. Yet, these carceral opportunists focus on building or maintaining a carceral facility. The examples I gave of New York and Hawaii earlier kind of spoke to this because in both cases, the proposal to build a new jail or a smaller jail or a more functional correctional system didn't eradicate the systems problems that exist in those states and in those municipalities. These opportunists will selectively focus on a new or improved jail instead of sentencing reforms or pretrial reforms that reduce the scope of policing overall, and they won't invest in programs that have no relationship to any kind of carceral agency. If the county or state are telling organizers that they care about treating people inside facilities humanely, holding them to this promise exposes the limits of their so-called humanism. And then the second strategy that I've seen be narratively effective is focusing on counter narratives that demonstrate how the most modernized and improved facilities still have people incarcerated in them who report correctional abuse, poor health care, and various forms of mistreatment. Can't get well in a cell is an example of how people have responded to promises of better treatment inside more reformed facilities, where anti-expansion organizers have said that adding more treatment or rehab inside a jail doesn't mean it's suddenly a more habitable setting. It's still a cage. But outside of these kinds of narrative responses, carceral humanism is also countered through organizing itself. And this is a point I really want to sort of emphasize. As Emmett said earlier, it's important to assess the actual reforms and policies being proposed and organize effectively against those reforms. For example, if a new jail is going to have more therapy, interrogating what kinds of therapy and how effective this is also critical. Often, or actually, an example is if the facility is meant specifically for women or aging people, then building coalitions with feminist organizations or organizations that work with the elderly will be important in order to present solutions, reforms, and narratives that accurately reflect their movement goals. Carceral humanism is an umbrella term, but to actually develop an organizing strategy means you need to get to the specifics of the reforms being proposed. If the humanist rhetoric is not just about aesthetics, but about literal services and programs that are attached to the facility expansion proposal, organizers have to be capable of assessing those programs, identifying their limits and weaknesses, and responding to them through strategic organizing. I also, like I said, want to take a second to acknowledge some of what's in the Q&A because I think it's relevant here and we'll have more time later too. But it's really true that not building a new facility or renovating an existing one doesn't mean that the municipality will automatically fund education or housing. I completely agree with that, which is why the organizing responses to carceral expansion have to build coalitions that are capable of credibly pushing for driving funding towards non-carceral demands. And then they have to be able to remove carceral functions from what's proposed. And then similarly, I also agree with what someone else shared about the critical importance of building with people inside these facilities and inside existing jails, detention centers, and prisons, because they're going to be best positioned to offer solutions and reforms that don't replicate the harm. Something that's not helpful, though, to respond to your question, Emmett, is denying that conditions improvements and more functional buildings are objectively better than the ones that are falling apart. The point is not to go back and forth about whether this reform is better or not, or new jail is better or not. It's not helpful for organizers to engage in pretending that some of these reforms are worse than a jail, but they shouldn't act as though these reforms are enough. The point is to focus on expanding demands and imagination beyond the jail and to avoid falling into the identitarian trap set by carceral humanists. They want organizers to think that by opposing a carceral humanist reform, they're failing to care for incarcerated people. Organizers have to refuse to be baited into this zero-sum dynamic by organizing in true solidarity and with conviction.
That is incredible. I love that. Looking more into organizing, James, your current work is actually focused on international solidarity. Does carceral humanism manifest in those fights as well? And if so, like, how does it?
So I noticed somebody in the questions asked about organization. So part of the reason why I shifted my emphasis a little bit to international solidarity is, well, because I'm a creature of the 60s and 70s. I'm old lefty, you know? And back in the day, we had an international perspective. And the more I became involved in issues around incarceration and jails and prison, I kind of saw the focus become narrower and narrower. And so we didn't we never talked about what happened in other countries. We didn't really have knowledge of what the prison and jail conditions were like in other countries, let alone what kind of organizing was going on there. So I for me now that's when I took that position, when I did interviews about that and so forth, that was before October 7th and before we saw a lot of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle in across the U.S. So there's an adjustment to that, but nonetheless, um, to build an organization that's really going to deal with prisons, we need to have an international perspective. We need to look at the global system of capitalism and how we confront that. So that's so for me, carceral humanism doesn't really fit in that into that mold. Carceral humanism for me is something that emerged at a specific historical moment in opposition to a mass movement against mass incarceration. So the authorities reshaped their and repackaged their arguments to make them look more in line with what was happening with what the movement was saying about prisons and jails. So they wanted to moderate the harm of prisons and jails, but not certainly not abolish them or even significantly reduce the prison populations. Now, what we've seen, and that so that was kind of viable through the 2010s um, up until after the mobilizations around George Floyd. But now, but after that, now we're dealing with a backlash. We're dealing with we're dealing with prison authorities and prison companies and and especially a national government that's punitive. They want to advance carcerality, incarceration, not carceral humanism. So I don't think, and internationally, what's happened is that historically, movements that have succeeded when they've been diluted, they've adopted something called neocolonialism. That is, you have a liberation movement that fights against a colonial power, and then they win their victory, but they end up having to dilute their program and opt for something called neocolonialism, which means basically that the colonial power remains powerful, but the people that were fighting against it have some control over the strings of government, but they don't really control the economy. So I think neocolonialism is kind of similar to the idea of carceral humanism, but I don't think we could call neocolonialism a form of carceral humanism.
Um, that's really interesting. I'm interested particularly in the way that you talked about the shift and the way that carceral humanism sort of manifest has been manifesting and like some of the narratives around it. And I know that the landscape around reform in general has changed pretty dramatically just in the past year. And so I'm kind of curious about what are some of the just talk to either of you about the more recent shifts you've seen around carceral humanist narratives and sort of how they're being used and how they're sort of appearing.
Yeah, I can start, and James, I can pass to you right after. But you know, under what we're experiencing right now are authoritarian conditions and escalated fascist violence, where there are more facilities being built, replaced, expanded, and renovated than facilities And then communities can even keep up with, and the lines around what can be achieved politically shift. We've seen over 20 new detention warehouses proposed in just the last 3 months. It's really hard to overstate the level of facility expansion and the pace that's happening. So, in a landscape where politicians are embracing law and order, expanding funding for law enforcement, and enthusiastically expanding criminalization, a nicer jail with more services, a new shelter, an alternative that keeps people out, legislation that makes it so that people can access more kinds of care, these become even more compelling, both as political demands and as efforts to staunch the flow of people into facilities. Our sense of what is too inhumane is subject to the worst versions of things. And right now, new, more terrible things get created every week. In these moments, it's difficult for communities and organizers to hold any kind of line, but especially an abolitionist one. And it's also incredibly critical. There are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people being targeted right now. Focusing on stopgaps and temporary relief is not a long-term movement building strategy. Making concessions that expand the system in order to deal with current crises will only further enable fascist power. And similarly, again, I see questions in the chat. We'll probably get to some of them, maybe not all, but lots of people in the chat are speaking to how just because certain kinds of reforms have been passed or are being considered doesn't mean that those reforms aren't violent, doesn't mean that they actually reduce the like intensity of fascist criminalization. In fact, there are several people in the questions talking about how under these kinds of conditions, like costly supervision becomes even more costly because people have less money and because there's higher unemployment, or the relationships between, new jails are expanded, they have more beds. These are the beds that then the jail gets to contract to ICE. So there's all sorts of ways that these expansions that are sold through carceral humanist narratives and promises then are still used to enable the worst of what's happening.
Thank you for that. James, did you want to
Sure, I can just add a little bit, but I think Juan did a good job of summing it up. Um, Obviously, there's a big advance on creating new facilities, particularly, this system of warehouses. And I think we need to we need to oppose those. And I mean, there are times when we have to make some compromises because there are moments when we can't actually win the victory that we need to win. But that doesn't mean that we need to change our overall perspective. It means we have to look at what's the situation that we're dealing with at the moment and what is the most effective way to mobilize against the forces that are really on the advance right now. So I think, and I mean, I don't have a solution, and I'm not saying we need to stop pushing for abolition, but that we need to recognize that at certain moments we're not going to be able to gain everything that we want, but we need to keep our eye on the prize. So that's that, and those are strategic moments for organizations to think about how do you fight for freedom, recognizing that freedom is not going to come tomorrow, it's not going to come next week. But in the meantime, you need to make sure that you have some space in order to continue that fight.
thank you for that. Well, that is great. I had one last question, and then I'll turn it over to Sarah for the Q&A. I'm curious of how, because we know that there's a lot of disparities in the criminal legal system along the lines of race, class, gender, all these other things, culture, all these other things. And I'm curious how carceral humanism, how you see it sort of interacting with these disparities. Does it for example, disguise them or exacerbate them, or does it just fail to keep its promise to change things? And that's for either field.
James, go for it.
Okay. Well, let me just speak to electronic monitoring. I mean, one of the things that we found as we researched electronic monitoring is that most of these counties or states that had dozens or even hundreds of people on electronic monitors, they didn't keep they didn't keep specific data about who was on that monitor. We know they knew what the racial breakdown was of that population, but they didn't reveal that. It's only in places like Chicago and San Francisco where there was powerful movements pressuring them to release that data that we actually got that information. But we knew from our interviews that it that this electronic monitoring was being used disproportionately on black and brown people. Obviously, in immigration, it was being used different disproportionately on brown folks in particular. And so, part of what carceral humanism does is it gives you a limited amount of data, so you can't actually really make a case for the racism that's embedded in the program because you can't access that data. So that's why getting the lived experience of people is so important, but it's also not exactly enough always to establish the racial bias in the system. So we know, for example, that part of the reason why people finally discovered in a more public way why the system of mass incarceration was so focused on black people. Part of the reason that happened was because Michelle Alexander wrote a book about it. She did. People in the black community knew that was happening, but but we needed to have that data in order to establish that. So I think from that we can kind of draw the conclusion that throughout the system there's racism, there's racial bias, and black people in particular are targeted. But I think we need to keep that keep pushing that idea and looking for other ways to establish the data that goes on that or get the stories of people that have been impacted by that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, and thank you both for that. Actually, this was a great discussion. I am going to turn it to Sarah now. Sarah's been looking at some of the questions from the Q&A function here, and we have a lot of really good engagement, and we probably won't be able to answer all of them, but I would love to get some of these answered.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, we've been getting such great engagement in the Q&A and a lot of questions that sort of touch on similar themes. So you may hear me ask your question in like a slightly different way, and that's because I've got like three or four versions of a question. But there's some really interesting ideas in here. One thing that came up a couple times is a question of whether the panelists think or in their experience that uh, sheriffs, other people on the carceral side of things, are operating in a knowingly manipulative way or whether they're acting in good faith. And I would add to that question, does it matter? And do you respond to them differently depending on whether or not you think that's true?
I can start and speak to this a little bit, which is, I think Sarah, you're right. Does it matter? Um, some things that we've said throughout this event is one, assessing your conditions is really important. There are going to be fights and there are going to be geographies where the sheriff has an inordinate amount of power to decide what happens to the facility, how many people get locked up, whether it's replaced. You can't consider the sheriff a non-stakeholder. And if that sheriff is using, or I use the example of Hawaii, a corrections professional was advocating for the new jails. But in any of these cases, if they have a lot of power to decide what happens, and they have a lot of power in the overall governance structure of the municipality, then yes, you have to try and respond to what is being said, regardless of whether or not you believe whether they really care about the people inside. I think there are lots of reasons that correctional administrators um, offer carceral humanist narratives. Sometimes it is because they are opportunistic and they're responding to calls for reform and they understand it's a way to get things passed. Sometimes it's because they are also dealing with the repercussions of overcrowded facilities, dilapidated conditions. These often come with huge price tags, and they too are responsible for the people who work inside the facilities. Sometimes it's because there is profit to be made from a jail expansion or a prison expansion. There are all sorts of different reasons, and it's hard to give a universal prescriptive on what to do when someone who is responsible for running these cages or incarcerating people is claiming that they can be improved or made more humane. And one additional thing I'll say is, though, understanding that anyone who is responsible for running a jail or a prison or making it better or making it more functional generally is never going to be a trustworthy interlocutor of what should be done. And that goes to Sarah's point of does it matter?
So just a quick addition to that. Um, so I think we have to recognize that law enforcement, let's say liberal law enforcement, their views are subject to change. I mean, it depends on the way the political movement. I mean, we saw a lot of black sheriffs going out and marching with Black Lives Matter activists during the 2010s and in solidarity with those who are responding to the murder of George Floyd. We have one of those people is now the sheriff in our local city, and he's no reformer. He's changed because the wind started blowing in another direction. So I think, as Mon has pointed out, these are not trustworthy allies. At the same time, you may have to use their momentary uh, conversion, their momentary moment of seeing the light in order to pass a certain piece of legislation or to get a certain policy to happen. But don't be surprised if they come back the next year leading the charge to reverse what you just passed.
And Mon, you said you had one more thing.
Yeah, and I guess one more thing that James just made me think of is that yes, often it's the heads of the departments of corrections, it's sheriffs, but in various examples and across many different contexts, you'll see that it's not just correctional administrators or politicians pushing for carceral humanism. Nonprofits, think tanks, data organizations, tech groups, and tech organizations all have in different ways and in different geographies pushed carceral humanist narratives because either that's what they do or they have something to gain. So there's usually a wide number of stakeholders that are being reflected in why carceral humanism is being pushed. And then the last thing I'll add is that depending on what the actual circumstances of a particular fight are, there are so many opportunities to use the carceral humanism against the people who want to improve or expand the jail by exacerbating the differences and conflicts between different parts of government and different agencies.
So can I just add one point, which you alluded to, and that is there's a lot of money in carceral humanism. So if you can't make money by building a jail, you can make money by funding various other carceral humanist programs and then wait till later on when you can build the jail.
Thank you. That was super interesting. A question just came in that sort of asked for us to go through a sort of example. And I think it could be really helpful to people to do that. So the question is, um, someone who is working with a nonprofit in New York, who is working around the issue of protecting in-person visitation in New York. They say, I know that children of incarcerated individuals are a huge chunk of the people pushing to protect it, but it doesn't push back directly on carceral systems as a whole. Would this fall under carceral humanism in your opinion? And could you walk through the pros and cons of focusing on this kind of campaign? On you're nodding, so I'm gonna turn to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, okay. I think it's a really, really good and important question that gets at a lot of the tensions around carceral humanism. And I think I actually answered this in another for another person in the Q&A, but I don't think that the point that any of us are making here is that there aren't worthwhile things to advocate for, or that there aren't policies and legislation and forms of decriminalization and things that mitigate harm inside that don't matter. And a lot of that gets surfaced when you have relationships with people inside cages. They are often the first to be like, this is what would be important. In-person visitations are really, really important for people inside prisons because it's about family, it's about connection, it's about reducing isolation. I think the larger I takeaway is more like the way that this campaigning is done or the way that people organize to preserve in-person visitations or anything that keeps these facilities slightly more livable, should not come paired with arguments that entrench these facilities, that entrench these systems, or that make them seem capable of being humane, caring, habitable. The way that we organize for these kinds of policies or reforms, we can do it without saying that these reforms will just like make these cages better forever and ever, or that a new facility is needed that has like more visiting hours or more visiting rooms. There are ways to pair our demands with long-term movement demands that ultimately focus on decarceration and closing down prisons.
So if I can just add that, I mean, it's also issues like this that, that the powers that be are able to divide movements. So when we had our jail campaign, we had a couple of mothers who basically went off and met with the sheriff and made a whole deal with the sheriff about having a visiting room, blah, 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 in the jail. And when we tried to talk to them about the bigger systemic issues, they didn't really want to engage, but the sheriff was very happy to talk to them, and I don't think he was talking to them out of the goodness of his heart, but he saw that this was a way to divide people. So it's something we have to be aware of in terms of how the powers that be divide and conquer.
Thanks. There are a number of questions about, and we've touched on this, we just touched on it a little bit, but there's a specific spin I want to talk about. There are a number of questions about how we navigate these questions about what to advocate for when we are organizing with people who are currently incarcerated. One person noted that there has been a move in their part of the world, I think they said they were in New York, to tokenize formerly incarcerated folks who are speaking, to speak on behalf of the perspectives that the system is interested in putting forward. And the question was, have you encountered that, and what are some of the best ways to counter that kind of strategy?
I can start. Or actually, James, go for it since
No,
that's your.
good.
Okay, I can start, which is to say, yeah, I think that there are definitely elements of tokenization. Maybe I'll say two things. One is that it is to many organizations' credit that they are able to build relationships with people inside that, and those are political relationships, and then meaningfully engage people inside those facilities or formerly incarcerated people and directly impacted people in demanding reform. Like, I'm not trying to deny how critical and important that effort and work is. And our perspective on this event is that carceral humanism is bad. And so when people who are incarcerated in these different facilities are being treated as monoliths, as though they all share the same perspective, when there's not meaningful investment in political education inside, that actually helps people broaden their understanding of what's possible, including the fact that these facilities don't have to exist and systems of supervision and surveillance don't have to exist. So when there's not an investment in political education and people are treated as a monolith and a handful of people's opinions are seen as incredibly integral to the reforms that are proposed, then that's disingenuous. And that's not the kind of organizing with people inside that is transformative, that pushes for solidarity. There are so many different kinds of experiences that people have when they're incarcerated, and many of those do lead people to think that these facilities shouldn't exist and different forms of surveillance shouldn't exist. And it's important to counter the tokenizing by building actual relationships, investing in political education with people inside cages that can counter, this like one narrative that's being offered.
I think that's really well put, Mon. And the issue of political education is really important, and that's not a possibility in every place either. I mean, it depends on what access people have to materials. Are there people there that are within the prison who are able to facilitate political education? Are there people on the outside that visit people or that correspond with people that are able to drive those processes forward? So it's very uneven, and and we can't also say that there are not people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated that see the whole process as a way for personal advancement and not really about movement building. So we just have to bear those things in mind. But political education is what's going to create a critical mass of people that are able to resist carceral humanism or are able to critique carceral humanism when it surfaces.
Thanks so much. Another question that came in that I think gets at something that we hear a lot in carceral conversations is the so-called Scandinavian model. Um, I know that I've heard a lot of, well, maybe if our prisons were more like Norway's prisons, things would be better. And this sometimes comes from fairly surprising places, I would say, and from voices that you might expect to have a different perspective. How do we engage, and James, you may have ideas with the international perspective here, how do we engage with the idea that prisons are better elsewhere, um, without giving, and how does that relate to the carceral humanist situation?
Well, I mean, the reason prisons are better in Norway is because Norway has a whole system of social welfare that doesn't exist in the United States. So, I mean, i- i- not only do they have education and resources inside the prison, but when people come out of prison, they've got access to housing, they've got access to medical care, they've got access to transportation, they've got access to therapy. They're going to have clothes. I mean, all their basic needs and more are going to be met by the social welfare system that's set up. So we can't build a Norwegian prison in the United States unless we can change that whole social infrastructure that people confront when they come out. That's what, as I said, in Illinois, it used to be that people got $10 when they came out of prison. So now As I noted, they've increased that to $25. But what is that? There's no housing, there's no resources for people. So we can't recreate a Norwegian prison in San Quentin like Governor Newsom wants to do unless he's willing to convert all of California into a social welfare state, which I don't think is going to happen.
Yeah, another, I think, way, I mean, like James said, but just another way of saying this is that the United States is nothing like Norway. It's a settler colony and an empire that uses mass incarceration and mass criminalization to sustain both of these projects. And that's why there isn't sufficient social provisioning, there isn't sufficient health care, and there isn't sufficient education for people outside of prisons, let alone inside them. The caging and detention and deportation of people is a big part of the American project. And making, if the prisons still exist, even if they're more, I guess, Scandinavian, whatever that means, they will still fundamentally be supporting both of those political projects that are inherent to the US.
Thanks so much. Um, I wish that we could get to more. I've answered a couple of questions in the chat. But Emmett, I'm going to pass it back to Emmett to close us out and share some resources, including some information about how you can stay in touch with us, so that we can continue this conversation. Emmett? Emmett, you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. So just yeah, just thank you all so much. This was an amazing discussion with our panelists. I just want to thank them again. Want to put up their info up here so folks can get in touch with them. And also to share some of our resources for opposing carceral humanist reforms. Some of them are our prison policy initiative resources here. There's also If They Build It, which Mon wrote, and a number of other things that we can share if folks are interested. Um, and then stay in touch with us. Here are our social medias. You can follow us here at Prison Policy Initiative. And finally, I just want to say, get in touch with our advocacy department. We work on a wide range of issues across pretty much everything, and we just look to find ways to sort of support people who are trying to push legislation or push policies that are actually working, not carceral humanists, and actually working to actually provide some relief. So please get in touch with us there. Um, but again, just really wanted to thank our panelists, Mon Mohabacha from CJE and James Kilgore from CJE, for this really illuminating conversation. And I really appreciate y'all being here. And yeah, thanks so much.